So in process of kind of putting things back together, these are the Clevite 77 rod bearings that I installed because I had problems getting the ACL bearings. You can notice how the oiling hole is chamfered and it's larger, and that's for volume and flow. But what that'll also do is affect oil pressure. If you notice, the factory replacement bearing has a much smaller oiling hole, and I never took the time to really look at the old shells when I removed them from the engine. The first time, these bearings probably only have about 2,000, 3,000 miles on them before my oil pump failed. Unfortunately, you know, I've done this, and you know, everything's looking so good so far. I mean, that's hardly any wear right there, right? But it's a pretty significant find. So we'll see where it takes us. All right, I got it back together. It's a couple of days later because I got interrupted and I couldn't get this thing back together the same day. Just too many interruptions. But here we are, man. Back together. Let's see what happens. See if we get any oil pressure. Okay, looking good. Looking good. Looking good. That's what I'm talking about. Much better on a cold start. So, significant difference there. So, to kind of walk it back, man, that's beautiful. To kind of walk it back, to give you guys a better clue what was happening, is I did have low oil pressure, you saw at the beginning of the video, and what it ended up being is I thought I was going to have a bad displacer ring assembly for the pump to get the oil, you know, circulating through the car. I thought it would have a hairline crack. Well, it didn't end up being that. When I pulled it apart, and y'all saw the video where the displacer rings and everything looked like they were okay, the used displacer rings, well, I'll show you what my rings came out looking like. These are the actual displacer rings for my pump, and they are not cracked. Right? They're actually, get that piece of tape off of there. They're actually in a pretty good, you know, pretty good shape for, if you consider this is 130,000+ miles and the car is 31 years old. So what ended up being was my oil pressure relief valve was stuck a little bit, and it being stuck a little bit, let oil pressure leak down. So it kind of was one of those things where I was gonna have to take the oil pan off anyway. And if I'm gonna take the oil pan off, then I'm not that much further away from replacing or removing the oil pump assembly and then going through and then checking it. So I did end up getting the Grosso gears installed. Everything is, I mean, look at that, man. That is excellent oil pressure. I couldn't be happier right now. That's the kind of oil pressure that I'm used to seeing, is a little over halfway up the gauge. So, you know, I'm thrilled, man. I'll get to drive this thing again. Life goes on, right? On to the next problem, I guess, when it occurs. Hopefully that won't be for a while. I'm trying to make it to where if I've got a problem, I upgrade, and I suggest if you're somebody who owns one of these cars, then my recommendation is do the same. Don't replace with the factory stuff, because you know as well as I do, eventually the factory stuff's going to break and you'll be right back to square one. But I think a couple of things here about my oil pressure being back up here. My oil pressure used to be like this whenever I first got the car, and it was always over halfway on a cold start. I mean, even with the engine warming up, it's still well over halfway. I mean, it's awesome. So that's what I'm used to. And I had a front crank seal failure one day after work, and I actually repaired the crank seal leak, man, 3.5 hours after work, on my back on the freaking asphalt. You know what I mean? Literally got out just before the security guard who secured our area locked everything down. So I did that on my back in short order, and then drove the car home. And then because I didn't know how long I had no oil pressure, I thought to myself, I think I'm going to replace the rod bearings. Well, in replacing the rod bearings, which was just a prudent thing to do because they were original, I used Clevite 77s. And there's nothing wrong with Clevite 77s, but the bigger difference here is the oil hole here. It is chamfered, which is great for flow. You get a lot more flow. But the oiling hole is also quite a bit larger than what the factory uses on the rods. So that being said, I mean, look at that. Look at the temperature, and then look at the oil pressure. That being said, you know, you're going to have lower oil pressure right off of the bat if you don't use the factory bearings, because I think pretty much every bearing out there, they use a larger oiling hole with chamfering, and that's great. But the problem with that is also Mitsubishi doesn't have, or nobody that I'm aware of makes, a high flow oil pump for a 6G72. And in order to offset that, you pretty much have to go to a high flow oil pump, and then use a high flow oil pump, you know, performance pump that produces enough flow to create enough pressure to return your pressure back to what you would expect to see on a stock set of bearings. So I would expect where my gauge is right now, and keep in mind my temperature is, I mean, the car's warming up great, right? With those other bearings, my gauge, as it was in this area, would be down here, just one tick below the 1/3 mark, and then it would jump up to a little bit higher than where it is whenever I would throttle the car. So I mean, you can kind of see where the gauge changed after I had, you know, the larger oiling holes in the bearings. So that's also something to kind of keep in mind. As I said in my other clip at the beginning of the video, the rule of thumb, guys, is 10 psi per 1,000 RPM. So however high you're going to rev the motor, you want at least, you know, times 10 on that pressure. So, you know, if you're revving it to 9,000 RPM, you want at least 90 psi oil pressure, right? So, and then so on, 80, 70, 60, 50, 40, 30. So you can kind of see where, you know, the need for an actual gauge comes in handy. Like I said, you know, this isn't accurate in terms of telling you an actual oil pressure number, right? But it is telling you whether or not your oil pressure is normal. And so in that terms, like on a very lightly modified car or a stock car, I see no problem with trusting this guy. I mean, it hasn't lied to me yet. It told me I had a problem. I paid attention to what it was telling me, and lo and behold, I did find a problem. I found a sticking oil pressure relief valve. And so that's something to consider. If you ever have this problem, I strongly recommend using the factory bearing, which isn't a bad bearing at all. The factory bearings are pretty dang good, unless you're trying to, you know, make 1,000 horsepower, 800 horsepower, 700 horsepower, something like that. I think up to around 450, 500 horsepower, the factory bearings will be fine, and you'll have better oil pressure because of it. So that's also something to consider. But like I say, on a lightly modified car, pay attention to this gauge. I mean, it may not be like perfectly accurate, but man, it'll tell you if something's wrong. If you know that your oil pressure gauge should be in a different area up here, then you'll know that something's wrong when it's only going down here, and then it's only popping up to here, or maybe it's only popping up to like right here. There's something wrong, you know, and it should be like, you know, well north of this tick right here. Whenever you throttle it, it should walk up that way, you know. So that's something to consider. Okay, you can see my oil pressure gauge went up there. what I'm used to seeing right there. So hopefully this video helps y'all out, man. Hopefully it helps anybody that runs into this problem and they think they're screwed. I mean, it's gonna hurt if you have cracked oil pressure, or if you have cracked oil gears in your pump. It's gonna hurt, man. But Grasso's the only one that's gonna be able to save your bacon there. But if you don't have cracked, gears, then the only way to really know what's going on for sure is pull that oil pan and then pull that oil pressure relief valve and check it, make sure it's not sticking. Mine was gummed up, and so that's what was causing my headaches, man. But there you have it, guys. Hopefully this helps somebody out. I know it's a boring video, I talk too much, but I'm trying to get you as much information as you can possibly get. You guys have a good one, man. I'm out. Man, so after doing some digging, I found that I also had a leaking oil pressure sensor unit. The sending unit was actually leaking. And I don't know if that leak popped up after I did the oil pump drive gears from Grasso, from Revenge Performance, the badass billet ones. But look at that oil pressure, bro. I mean, I've never had a cold start with oil pressure that kick ass, dude. So I'm pretty impressed with the amount of oil pressure coming out of this thing. I mean, that gives me the confidence to say definitely, grab a set of these oil pump gears, even if you don't have an oil pump issue. Because if you decide you're going to spin the motor higher in the RPM, if you decide you're going to take it like 75, 8,000 RPM, 7,500, you'll have that much more protection. Look at that, man. That is just insane. Yeah, and so my oil pressure sender was also skewing my readings a little bit because it was leaking from the base, and so now no more leaks. Look at that, and that's at idle. Warming up. Pretty good stuff.